On behalf of ITI, the Trade Association of the Technology Industry, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our important discussion today. As the Trade Association of the Tech Industry, ITI has an important responsibility to do what we can to address endemic racism and persistent discrimination in society. We need to act to advance the work of the industry and to encourage the industry to do more and to do better. And we need to look at ourselves as an organization to ensure our hiring practices and our policies confront racial bias. As an industry, ITI is advancing these important issues through our Inclusive Innovation Working Group, where tech industry leaders are working through ITI on issues like STEM education, diversity in hiring, and advancing economic opportunity for underserved minority communities. As an organization, ITI has annual strategic goals, and since 2019, they have included diversity, equity, and inclusion goals to improve who we are as an organization. This is a process, it takes time and investment, and we are making progress. Much of our progress and our future work is due to the efforts of Tracie Daniels of Synergy Consulting. Tracie is helping us at ITI to move from analysis to discussion to action, and she's graciously agreed to moderate a discussion today on how all organizations can do the same. We're going to talk today about confronting racial bias, and Tracie is going to lead our discussion of industry experts. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Tracie Daniels, to lead today's discussion. Tracie?
Thank you so much, Jason. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be a part of this fantastic session. I couldn't wait to be on board, and so thank you for asking. And I could not, I've been waiting all week, so I'm very excited to be a part of this wonderful discussion. So before we get into our esteemed panel, I will go over some housekeeping issues around how we're going to conduct the panel discussion. So the first probably 30 to 45 minutes will be between the moderator and the panelists, where we'll be going through a number of questions, discussing the why, the what, and the how do we move forward with action-oriented solutions. Then we'll have an opportunity for you as the attendees and members to ask our panelists questions. And so we're going to open up the lines around 4:45 to have an open dialogue. During that time or before that time, if you have a question, feel free to enter it in the chat panel, and we'll start with the first question when we open it up for Q&A. So I just want to dive right in because I want to take the entire hour that we have with these fantastic folks. So I'm going to introduce briefly the panelists. We have Dr. Beverly Vandiver, who's the Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. Notice I said the, my son told me I had to say The Ohio State University. Then we have Lesley Slaton Brown, an award-winning marketing executive who currently serves as the Chief Diversity Officer at HP. We have Margot Goodson, a thought leader in diversity, inclusion, and cultural competence strategies, and the North American D&I lead at SAP. And finally, we have Adjoa B. Asamoah, a highly sought-after, award-winning impact strategist who has led the advocacy efforts to legally establish the nation's first office on African American affairs and introduce and pass the historic Crown Act, which we'll learn about further in this session. And she's also the founder of ABA Consulting. So please help me welcome our panelists to this timely discussion. And in talking about the timeliness of why this discussion needs to be had around confronting racial bias in the workplace, that's the first question I want to throw out to the panelists. There is no time like the present, right, to really discuss confronting racial bias in the workplace. So the first question that I want all of you to answer is the why. Why is it necessary to have this conversation right now? And so we'll start with Dr. Vandiver, Lesley, Margot, and Adjoa in that order. So Dr. Vandiver, the why.
Good afternoon, everyone. The why is probably fairly easy, and I suspect that as we start talking about it, the answer is going to be quite redundant. I mean, we see what's happening out in the streets, and we see what's happening as a result of not only being out on the streets and what the shootings and the protests, but also in the midst of a pandemic, and then in the midst of an atmosphere in the United States that we have not seen since the 1940s, 30s, and 20s. And so we're now watching millennials and other people experience something that 2 generations ago, no one would have thought was going to be occurring in the 21st century. And so at this point, we have no choice but to rise back up to the occasion to sort of address it now, because it's just as virulent as it was a century ago.
And you know what, I'm just going to piggyback off of that. And that is, Dr. Vandiver is so right. In addition to that, it is about, you know, we've got to take the moment and move it into the movement, into an evolution, a cultural evolution. And so the investment that we make today, and by the way, you know, thank goodness for technology, right? And so I'm not quite sure that these things are so new as they are more visible. And so you cannot change what you cannot confront. And so our effort is around how we now bring greater visibility, how we now bring our leadership into, in the corporate environment at least, into discussion and problem solving with us. And more than that, holding them accountable in order to get to the change that we need to see happen.
I couldn't agree more. And I just really, you know, think it's important for us to discuss, because as humans, right, we do not exist in isolation. And so our inherent diversity comes along with us wherever we go and whatever we do. And it impacts us profoundly. So the societal norms, what's happening, current events, the business policies and practices, those are all very important and key to what we do. And whether it's gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, veteran status, we know that lots of communities are marginalized, and we hold the intersectionality even with our race, that's a social construct that has to be broken down. And the time is now, and the time is now to make that change. We can only authentically bring ourselves to the workplace and do our best if equality, equity, humanity are all a part of the conversation, are all a part of our evolution, not just in the workplace, but in our spiritual homes and our society at large, the community-oriented activities we do, and the like. So all of that is key to what we're addressing today, and I thank you for having me as part of this conversation.
Excellent.
I genuinely applaud ITI for convening this critically important conversation and inviting me to be part of it. I think it is important, if we're going to have meaningful dialogue today, for me to speak truth to power. So it's worth just putting on the record that the fact that these conversations are welcomed, but they are certainly overdue in many spaces. Anti-Blackness isn't new. It has plagued the US since its creation. And while the tragic murders of Breonna Taylor, whose murder was just deemed justified, Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by some pseudo-deputized police, and even brother George Floyd, who sadly anticipated what would happen to him that day. They have drawn this country to another event horizon, one sort of converging amid a global pandemic that was mentioned, that is still disrupting national systems and the way we once lived. So I just need to say the blatant disregard for Black life is certainly not new. We should not have had to witness the public lynching of a Black man as he narrated his own death, asked for his children to be told that he loved them, and called out for his deceased mother, for some of our leaders to finally be in a place where declaring Black Lives Matter is considered progress. I think the multiracial, cross-class, intergenerational coalition of folks declaring Black Lives Matter is the reason some people are now ready to have this conversation. And as more Americans call for the recognition of Black people's humanity and demands for a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive world become louder, they cannot be dismissed. So I think it's important to leverage this opportunity to explore the ways in which we can certainly move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Adjoa. Working for ways to move forward, and that's where we're going to get to. We have to first uncover the why it's necessary. And now it's time to get to the what. And I know for some of you, the what may be obvious, right? But for others, it may not be readily apparent as to how racial bias shows up in the workplace. So what does that look like? Everyone has a different perspective. Everyone has different stories. Some have similar experiences, but still it shapes them differently. So let's talk about, to each of you, and this question is to each of you again, through your professional or personal experience, body of work, or even research that you've conducted, how does racial bias show itself in the workplace? So we'll start this one with Adjoa, Lesley, Margot, and Dr. Vandiver.
Thank you so much for that question. It is critically important for us to actually have the conversation where we're talking about the ways in which it shows up. Racial bias is everywhere, and it shows up in a number of ways. I work at the intersection of policy and politics, and the history of government-sanctioned oppression is real, and it must be tackled. It's why I am personally focused on getting more Black and Brown people and people who will value Black and Brown people elected, and it's why I have co-authored and led advocacy efforts for racial equity legislation. Black people have been here for over 400 years, and we were, of course, forcibly removed from our homeland and during an African Holocaust, and of which an unconscionable Middle Passage is part of it. The majority of our ancestors were enslaved for roughly 246 of those years. The government policy known as slave codes, then later Black codes, led us to this moment essentially. And so I will contain my love of history and not bore everybody with all of that, but to answer your actual question, racial bias shows up in the workplace in many ways, implicitly and explicitly, through microaggressions and hiring and promotion practices, through purported race-neutral policies to the ways entry-level employees often have no structural system to help them ascend to leadership, through the lack of representation in the C-suite, and sadly still sometimes in ways in which people display it physically, like you see people still clutching their bag in the elevator. So again, it shows up in a number of different ways based on, where you are, but that's just sort of my personal experience.
And again, I'm just going to build off of that because I believe it is, all of those things. And it's interesting because we see it show up in spaces where it's the most critical need, right? So board of directors. And so one of the things that we had the opportunity to do within HP when we separated in November of 2015 was to very intentionally change that construct of what the board makeup looks like. The challenge with that, though, is that when you still use the organizations, whether it's the consultants, hiring recruiters, different things like that, they still are in using the same methodologies that they typically use, right? So when you do that, you also have to be ready to be bold and be courageous to continue to push back. So in doing so, we were able to build out our board of directors as a diverse board of directors with over 58-ish% total minority with women ethnic makeup. And so you see it at the board level, and Adjoa mentioned you see it in the hiring and the recruiting, you see it in the bonus structure, you see it in promotional opportunities at every single level. And so so some of the things that we need to work to change, and we're doing this across our organization from HR to our legal and governance organization, is to work with folks like Adjoa and ITI in order to change policy, to make policy different. And I just have to take one quick moment to give you a shout out on the Crown Bill, right? And thank you for leading that effort. And it makes a difference, because when you talk about bias, I could never get in the door in some organizations, some companies, because of this alone, right? And so thank you for that.
Yes, I echo that. Thank you. As I rock the same hairdo, similar hairdo, right? And certainly diversifying our methodologies to diversify our results is what's going to get us there, and truly making D&I our DNA in corporate America, so that it becomes the foundational aspect of which we transact business, as we treat our employees, as we look at our customers, our technology, our interactions. When it becomes the foundation of what we're doing and how we're doing it, it will make a difference. I'd like to share with you from a December 2019, so this isn't reactive or responsive to what's happening this year, but ongoing. There was a study done from the Center for Talent Innovation report around being Black in corporate America. And it talks about Black professionals only holding 3.2% of all executive senior leadership roles and less than 1% of Fortune 500 CEO positions, despite comprising 12% of the overall labor force. So 12% of the labor force, but only 3.2% of executive roles, 1% of the CEOs. So that right there, you don't have to be a mathematician to see the disparity there. And that Black professionals, going back to what was mentioned about microaggressions, are more likely to encounter prejudice and microaggressions than any other racial or ethnic group in the workplace. So, you look at your workplace as being your second family, and you try to come and execute the job that you are there assigned to do and your responsibilities and the career growth you desire for it. Yet you have these other non-performance related matters that impact your daily ability to put forth the results that the business is requiring you to do. So really sharing that information from a data perspective, but understanding that foundationally as a business imperative that drives innovation, productivity, financial results, it has to become the DNA of our workplaces in order for it to really have the impact to drive those systemic changes and policy interventions and such that we talked about already.
For me, I'm going to take a personal slant, because everything that these wonderful women have said, I can't repeat that. But what I am going to talk about is that the bias, that when it shows up, it's a result of the long-term socialization of a cultural lens that people are not even aware most of the time that they're showing. And research has already indicated that when people have their preferences, they lean toward, not even thinking about it, people who look like them, who think like them, who operate like them. And so it's no wonder that when we have talked about bias, it pops up everywhere. But from an academic and a research experience, from my perspective, what I saw pop up from this journey, from coming from Appalachia with parents with an 8th grade education to get an advanced degree, is that the issues came around with who was willing to invest in me. There was a bias regarding who was willing to invest, who was willing to put time. And sometimes you can get in this space where they give you a job and you're all on your own, and there's not anybody else there rooting for you who recognizes the value and worth of what you're doing. And when you talk about publications, trying to get something published, if it wasn't something that was mainstream, denied, rejected. Why aren't you doing comparative studies, cross-cultural stuff, versus looking at research about Black people as its own entity of strength? The same thing regarding the intellectual recognition. And then the unfortunate thing that besides the hair, that is a bias, and all of us, I think most of us are rocking natural hair. The thing about it is the issue of colorism. The unfortunate truth is that because of my light skin color, I had privileges regarding that, but at the same time, knowing that privilege was not about recognizing me for who I am, but also connecting me to another way of being brought into the system that's mainstream.
Can I just jump in before, I know that I've already given my answer.
Oh, you're good.
Okay. Doc, you are speaking my language. In another world, I wear an adjunct professor hat on top of my natural hair. So I've blown it out, and it's important to realize that the work is about being able to rock it, you know, braid it, twist it, lock it, band 2 knots, blow it out like mine is today, or twist like I had 2 days ago. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, because you're like, most people, I'm like, yep, on top of this natural hair, I sometimes wear an academic hat. But you are really talking about something that's critically important as we are talking about what I call JEDI. I don't just, I mean, racial equity, yes, but justice and diversity and inclusion, all of those things are important, and it's important for us to distinguish between them. But, and I'm a doctoral candidate, so that's why I'm just shaking my head while you're talking. Even something like gender, and the expectation that women are responsible when you're putting together your package to go up for tenure. There is a professor who did her work. She did some important work just around the parenting on the, while you're, what was it? Ascending to tenure while parenting. And the fact that women are expected to be able to write and get published at the same levels to pursue tenure as men, but the responsibility of being a parent and still making ballet lessons and cooking dinner, et cetera, they don't disappear. So I just wanted to echo that you are speaking to me today when you were talking about that piece.
Thank you, Adjoa. You know what? We're going to stay with you because we've talked about the Crown Act. We've alluded to it. I want you to enlighten our listeners, but before you do, I'm gonna tell you, Margot, I'm gonna steal that D&I in our DNA. So just, I mean, we're gonna share that, okay? Because it's so impactful. It's simple yet incredibly impactful.
Definitely.
So Adjoa, tell us about the Crown Act and what have you found as a consultant that will inform how biases affect discrimination against Black and Indigenous people of color?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. We've been talking about it, but I'm happy to just, you know, build on that piece of the conversation. So the Crown Act sort of came to be, like so many things come to be, and a group of sisters were at a brunch that was hosted by Dove at the Essence Festival, literally at a brunch. And a couple of sisters were sitting around the table, one who's an executive and really demonstrates what it looks like to be an executive who still understands and can reimagine what corporate social responsibility looks like. She said she wanted to do something meaningful, and we got to talking about hair discrimination and the fact that we've experienced it throughout our own professional careers, and we've known students who have been on the receiving end of disproportionate discipline, being told that they can't participate in graduation exercises, or they've been sent home because they had braids, sent home because they have locks. And I think we collectively gasped as a community, and not just of Black people, but just literally as a society, when we witnessed a student wrestler who had earned the right to participate in a match.
That's right.
Forced with a decision that a student, he was a boy, not a man. I don't use the language men to talk about boys. He was a boy, and he was forced with a decision that he should have never had to make. And that was choosing between having his identity attacked and his locks forcibly cut, or participating in the match that he had actually earned the right to participate in. So a group of sisters, small but mighty team, AC, Kelly, or Lena, myself, Melanie, and Marcy, said, we are going to tackle this. I'm the one who works at the intersection of politics and policy, so I developed the legislative strategy for it. Have a creative sister, because nobody was talking about this issue in the mainstream media, although we know it's not a new issue, it's something that's happened for years. So the media has played a huge part in this, but what it does explicitly, it amends the definition of race, acknowledging that race is a social construct, but it does not make racism any less real. It amends the definition of race to include traits that are historically associated with it, such as hair texture and including protective styles. So states have existing prohibitions against racial discrimination, but without, because of this immutability argument, because we can straighten our hair, but we shouldn't have to, this immutability argument means that hair is not covered in the existing prohibitions against racial discrimination without the bill. So that's what the bill is. It's passed in 8 state legislatures, although one governor vetoed it. Nebraska state legislature actually passed it, and then the governor vetoed it. And just this week, on Monday, I am beyond proud because it's my personal baby and I work with my good friends in Congress. Congressman Cedric Richmond co-leads Marsha Fudge and Barbara Lee and Ayanna Pressley. The bill that they championed in the U.S. House of Representatives passed. And so there is so much more work to do. Probably won't see the light of day in this Senate, but we are working nationwide. The support has been dynamic. And the one thing I want to say, and before I pass the mic to my esteemed colleagues, is there is support for it. And when you see leaders of organizations, not just civil rights organizations, but your civically engaged organizations and your corporations, Sony Music, again, Dove, but you also see organizations like the sororities, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, the Links, the Association of Black Psychologists, LDF, NAACP, National Action Network, and so many others have come together, over 70 organizations, to support this legislation. And so that it explicitly outlaws racial discrimination in the form of hair discrimination.
Excellent. Oh my God, how empowering. You know, Lesley, Margot, and I were just talking about in the pre-session headphones customized for natural hair. So we'll get you working on that, Adjoa. You get your colleagues together and start working on that. Okay, now I'm going to shift to the how, because we're getting into how do we do this? How do we go from talk to action, right? How do we go from talk to action? So Lesley and Margot, I'm going to go back to you. What are the methods used at HP and SAP to position the respective companies as diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders in the technology industry? So if you could talk through that and just kind of identify 3 small steps that other technology companies and industries can do to make a difference, that would be helpful. So we'll start with Lesley and Margot can wrap it up.
Yeah, so one of the things I like to do, and when I think about our leadership, is really force leadership to look at and making bold moves. And so how do you flex out what you're doing? So we as women of color, in particular, Black women, we come into the workplace and we are taught, I think from a very early age, that you make space for others because you stand on the shoulders of others, right? And so I like to actually challenge our leadership in general. How can you make space for others? And so we started with our chief marketing officer, for example, really going out to the communications and marketing organizations to say, we want to hold you to the same level of accountability that we're being held to. And in the highest level, so director level and above, those people that are working on our accounts, we want to see the diversity. We want to see women. We want to see ethnicities. We want to see race, right? And so we did that, and we started that back in 2016, and we've seen 400% increase on our accounts for women, for minorities. We did that with legal. We did a 10% holdback with our law firms to say those people that represent us and represent our voice need to look like us and look like and represent our voice. And so we saw that with our legal and accounting firms. We did that in Treasury even. So every single place across the organization, in businesses and functions, there's something that leaders can do more and greater than what they're doing internally to influence externally in the industries that we work in. As of recent, and I say post George Floyd, God rest his soul, but we went back out with, from a legal standpoint, to say, you know what? We know that systemic racism exists. Let's not pretend, right? And so how about we look at if we can start from the top, and as I said, we did ourselves with our board of directors. Well, let's push out, and we did we're pushing for legislation in the state of California for Blacks on boards of directors. When you look at the numbers, the decrease from even 10 years ago, we're worse off now than we were 10 years ago. right? In Blacks as CEOs and on boards of directors. And so we're pushing for legislation in that case. And Kim Rivera, our general counsel and head of strategy, is leading that effort. And so those are just some examples of the types of things that Black-owned banks. Let's take some of our funds, let's move them to Black-owned banks. And we've ignited, and this is what I love about the why now and the opportunity that we have, is I often say, folks, the sky is the limit. You can sit by and watch it happen, or you can be a part of making it happen, right?
Yeah, so let's make it happen, right? And I think that what I can speak to from SAP's perspective is we've actually looked at intersectionality and taken that approach to some of the things that we're doing. So when we talk about growing women in leadership and women in expert roles, we look at women of color, we look at how we can have that intersection there. When we talk about some of the legislative approaches that we've taken around business equality in the LGBTQ+ community, we look at the intersection into race and understand that none of these exist separately. We've set targets and put accountability and measurement tools around it. We have a dashboard that we look at and that managers have access to understand their gender mix and things of that nature. We've partnered with talent acquisition in a very meaningful way, more so in the recent months in this past year, to make sure that not only how are you sourcing, recruiting, and attracting talent, but what are you doing in the onboarding, engagement, and retention of that talent? How are you developing them? So career development, advancement, and then what are we doing from a supplier diversity perspective, right? We launched a Spotlight Black Businesses this year so that we can ensure that, yes, we're all in our virtual home offices now. We're not in the workplace as often as we were just earlier this year. And so instead of looking at what we can't change with respect to our technology purchases, what can we change as it relates to items we order, services that we engage in, things that we do personally and professionally to really support the Black-owned businesses that are out here making it and being the underlying foundation for corporate America and the results that are driven. We've taken a leadership in technology term revision, and I know this might be coming up further, but in really revising some of the racially charged terminology that is currently used in technology to ensure that we're being more inclusive in that. So those are some of the areas that I know that we focused on, setting targets and having measurable accountability around that, partnership internally and externally with stakeholders, support of Black-owned businesses, policy changes, because let's face it, you can aspirationally state anything you want to do, but unless you have policies to support it, that's what really drives it. And SAP's mission, even for our customer partner ecosystem, has always been helping the world run better and improve people's lives. Well, that includes our workforce, employees' lives. That includes our ecosystem, our customers' lives, our partners' lives, our supplier diversity, and how we do our engagement. So those are areas that we feel that we can tangibly and sustainably impact and make change with and through. And we partner even with our corporate social responsibility entity within SAP to ensure that as we go out into the communities that we are tangibly utilizing those opportunities in a reciprocal manner. So not just what we're given, but how can we leverage their business? How can we help them? How can we employ them, partner with them, contract, and even have those intersectional touches with our customers and partners to use them and require that through those certification programs that might exist with some of those entities that we look at from bodies that exist for their supplier diversification purposes that touch CSR. So that's a few things that we're doing and that we're looking to accelerate as the time is now.
Thank you, Mark. I was going to say a few, but you guys have laid it out, and so it's not so important as to when you start. It's that you start, right?
Yes.
And what you get into is not that important as getting into something. Let's do something to start making this movement forward. But Dr. Vandiver, I'm going to go to you because in practice, right, that's great, but research has to guide the practice, right? And so from your world, can you share what you all are doing at the Kirwan Institute for Race and Ethnicity and how employers and employees can use your products, services, training exercises, et cetera? Can you provide some resource information on that?
Sure. Just so people know, the Kirwan Institute is the study for race and ethnicity, and our mission is to sort of try to create a more inclusive society. in regard to those two entities. And so as a result of that, we have worked on trying to establish a strong network inside and outside of the academy. And of course, our reputation is known for community engagement, implicit bias, and metropolitan changes, opportunity mapping. As noted, the Kirwan Institute is a national leader in training onto how implicit biases can shape the cognition, attitudes, and even behavior. So we're talking about the ABCs: affect, behavior, and cognition. And based upon research, because this is based upon mostly coming out of social psychology, that we've used as a foundation to create a series of implicit bias sessions and look at how it operates in various domains in terms of the workforce, in healthcare, criminal justice, education, and housing. And then we try to intersect in these modules, looking at how that sort of embeds in the organizational structure and even in neighborhood level outcomes and stuff. To ensure that our training has become accessible, because it has been a lot of demand, as you would know recently, we now have shared a host of free online training and resources that can provide an introduction to the implicit bias. And we also are expanding our conversation to offering explicit bias, equity training, and civic engagement and stuff. So I know that I want people to be aware. If you go to the website, you'll be able to see, if you go to kirwaninstitute.osu.edu, there is, under the training and resources, the beginning implicit bias modules that anybody can use. And then of course, when we do, right now we're doing virtual training, but as we do virtual training, we've done it from K to higher education, from local city government all the way to national level senators and stuff. And then we do healthcare professionals, non-for-profits, foundations, and just a variety of other areas. I hope that answered my question.
Yes, it did. Thank you, Dr. Vandiver. So we're still on that leadership track, right? Talking about putting things into practice. And so this is for you, Adjoa, following up on the previous question. So we understand that leaders have a responsibility, right, to address racial bias at all levels in the organization. And so from your perspective, what do you think is needed from them? Most importantly, what is needed from our leaders in our organization?
I think the short answer is intentionality versus dismissal, realizing the benefits of diversity, understanding the JEDI that I keep saying, which simply stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is central to bringing about cohesiveness in your teams. Understanding the fact that empirical data reveal that employees with an appreciation for differences contribute to a more positive work climate and culture. I'm an applied behavior analyst, doc, so again, you're speaking my language. Really not being in denial or thinking because you self-identify as an ally when that's actually a title that must be given to you, that the problem doesn't exist in your organization. And then, you know, retaining people who actually do this work and have a verifiable history of doing it and documented expertise. Not just going for the larger firms because when they pitch, they include, you know, a picture of the one or two Black or brown people who work there and not really asking questions about their own leadership and their own diversity. So again, I think that the answer is really about, we need leaders who are intentional about change.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And that intentionality is going to exhibit itself in multiple different ways, but the point is it's coming from a place of intentionality. And so for that, I now want to shift, because we've been talking about leaders, and there's a dual responsibility, right? Because we are talking about confronting racial bias in the workplace, what must employers and employees can do. So there's a responsibility on the employees, right, to confront their own biases. And so for this question, I'm going to go to Dr. Vandiver and Lesley. So it doesn't solely rely on leadership making changes, right? What can employees do from your perspective to actively disrupt their own biases and preconceived patterns? And that may look like unintentionally or intentionally segregating themselves, along the lines of race, age, or work stream, what needs to happen for that employee or to that employee, or what the change that the employee needs to make to disrupt their own bias?
Well, I'm going to build off of what Adjoa says, because this whole idea is about intentionality. And besides intent, you got to be motivated. So employees have got to be motivated. And the question is this going to be an internal motivation or is an external one by the employers? But if they're motivated to disrupt those biases, research has been really clear on this, that we are socialized into stereotype and be prejudiced. It's because it's how we grow up. And that is a long-term pattern that they have found that only gets disrupted because we make it automatic. We are in a world of having to quickly judge what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, without having to filter out 100,000 stimuli. So they have found that what you have to do is slow down an automatic process, and that you've got to create mindfulness. And so those people who have intent to want to be better really have to stop themselves from doing and saying things and then begin to reshape that. And it's a long-term process. For me, the example that I'm now struggling with is our language regarding gender and sexual identity has changed. And one of the things that I work on a daily basis, because I'm used to he, she, whatever, well, that's not always proper. And so having to stop that automaticity of how I've been trained and raised, and people may think I'm going to be deliberately biased, but I'm not even thinking about that in my head. Now, some people are deliberately biased. So it means that somebody's got to take some effort and with some guidance to disrupt that pattern of thinking, disrupt that and know that the habit takes time. They know that at least a minimum of 3 months to change a habit, and even longer to have it to be sustainable. So why wouldn't we also want to think in those terms of trying to disrupt biases, that we've got to make it tangible, very practical, and very specific, and sort of give people those things. If somebody's not intentional or motivated by it, then I think that the next step is, if you want employees to do it, the environment and the expectation of the institution must change. And if that does not change, you will have a pocket of people trying to do the right thing and the rest of them doing nothing.
Right.
And I'd like to weave in a little bit too, Tracie, if I may, from the previous question about what do leaders need to do?
Yeah.
Because I also think that we can't forget that leaders too are individuals, right? And so I think the intentionality, absolutely. And in addition to that, I think empathy for not only leaders, but also for individual contributors or just employees, is the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. Imagine yourself. And I know we don't want to imagine this, but imagine a knee in your neck. Just imagine that for a minute. How about your son? How about your daughter or your husband? You have to be able to feel that, unless you're just a total narcissist, but you have to be able to feel that. And I believe that until we can really start better empathizing in the situations, it takes stop and listening to people's stories as well. And so we kind of jump back to the previous question, though, is managers, I think, need to be very intentional about reaching out to their people and understanding how they're doing, because not only is it all this social unrest, it is about COVID. I mean, we have been impacted, people of color, women, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, the underrepresented groups and marginalized groups are even more so right, impacted in the state that we're in with this pandemic. And so leaders need to reach out, intentionally reach out, very deliberately reach out. And I think in a lot of cases, you're pushing them out of their comfort zone. And I think that same thing applies to some employees, is you have got to get comfortable being uncomfortable with these conversations, because guess what? We have walked these dual paths as women and as people of color, and especially in the corporate environment, having to fight for policy, having to be educators our entire lives. Yeah. And so we're now asking you to empathize with us and join us in this together, right? So,
and if I could just add, and I know it wasn't my question, but
no, you're good. Go on with it.
Go ahead, Margot. Go.
Being culturally competent,
yeah,
being committed to change matters no matter what level you are. And we have this hierarchical structure where we think leaders are just those that hold a C-suite position or executive title, but we're all leaders in the rights of what we are responsible for, whether that's our daily task at work or at home. And we have to pause to recognize and pay attention to what's happening, understand our own judgments that are underneath what a scenario might be taking place, understand and acknowledge our own reactions as individuals, because we are, and the neurological impact that has. Also understand the normalcy of bias. I think people hear the words bias or unconscious bias and they get their feathers all ruffled. Yet it is very normal to have attention biases, affinity biases, association biases that just really pull us into various scenarios that impact daily life, let alone the workplace. But I think people being courageous and certainly getting comfortable with being uncomfortable because of the growth that comes with that is very key. But that personal acknowledgement, that intentionality to execute a plan no matter where you fall in it, if you're going to be an advocate, if you're going to be an accomplice more so than an ally, really makes a difference in the what comes next and the how and the business outcome and the results oriented and you want to come to. So I just wanted to add that because that does impact, I think, each of us.
I'm glad you did, Margot, because I think we've got to get to more constructive conversations versus divisive conversations.
Absolutely.
It does take courage. It takes boldness. It takes vulnerability. It takes, kind of pushing yourself, as I said, kind of outside of that comfort zone, in order to get to the change that we want to see culturally.
Yeah.
We've got to be able to embrace those things.
And know that it's a corporate culture too, right? On top of it all.
And I just want to jump in and say that combining those two is what Lesley was talking about before, the perspective taking, how powerful it is that people take that risk to try to take the other perspective, because it's powerful. And I will tell you, I've used that all through academia, because it makes a difference when people start telling me that they're thinking of students of color differently. And then I say, what if this was your daughter? What if this was your child? Is this how you want them to be treated? And there's a pause, because now they've got to really go through that and start thinking, are they thinking differently? Because they wouldn't want their daughter or their son to be treated this way. So I think Lesley's right. It takes courage to be willing to go there and also be willing to start thinking differently than what they normally do.
And that word pause is actually a D&I intervention strategy. It has a full acronym and some application to it. So that's something that I think people understand and be able to do that makes a difference. It's more so those interventions and intentionality than anything else.
The therapist in me has to chime in just because it's aligned with the question that's actually in the Q&A.
Yeah.
We also have to make sure that, yes, it is important for employees at all levels to be able to weigh in terms of what kind of a work culture we want to see. But we have to be mindful not to further burden those people who are on the receiving end. It was traumatic for me because George Floyd literally reminds me of my brother, not figuratively, but literally in terms of stature, height, height. He literally reminds me of my brother. So I just wanted to weigh in and say that we also have to not put the burden of Black people, Black and brown folks, and people who belong to these other groups that have been marginalized to them help other people feel better about themselves, and then to discuss back pain and to relive our trauma just so that other people can feel better. So I just wanted to
deal with their guilt.
and put
Yeah,
that point.
that's right.
We
That's
want
right.
people to be inclusive, but let's not burden them with having to make everybody else feel better when we are literally struggling and can't get on the Zoom. And in between meetings, we're actually breaking down and crying because we realize that members of our family are literally a knee away from being a hashtag, and that is uncomfortable. So we don't want to we want to make sure that we're not burdening our own people.
Absolutely.
And we don't want to burden our own people yes, and we need to show people how we want to be treated. If you don't train people to treat you how you want to be treated, you leave it up to them to make the decision and for them to speculate on how best to interact with us, that could hurt us too. So we have to be mindful that no, we should not be burdened with making them feel better. At the same time, we definitely have to be courageous enough to be able to assist in the solutions, because someone else who hasn't had our experience to provide the solutions for us will be a huge miss. And you take just a normal activity that happened when they brought out the iPhones and they did the facial recognition and they didn't include us in that. It didn't work for us, right? How does that happen? Because you did not involve the people who would be a part of that. That was a marketing mistake. But when you talk about an everyday corporate culture, you want to know how to treat your people, your colleagues of color, at least speak to their employee resource groups, at least understand what the needs are, so that no, they're not burdened with the solution, but they are certainly part of the process, and that you acknowledge and extend that olive branch to and get the empathy and the information to prevent future outcomes, but also present plausible solutions.
Yeah,
Excellent.
and make that a best practice. You know, it doesn't take, it doesn't have to be a George Floyd incident, you know, for you to reach out to your employee resource group. Reach out for innovations and reach out for new processes and transformation, and test when you're doing organizational design, and, you know, and those things. Just make it a best practice within whatever it is you're doing.
And I'm going to stir the pot a little bit if Tracie does not mind.
Go right ahead. It's
Tracie,
a lot of goodness. It's a lot of goodness, Dr. Vandiver.
We've already stirred the pot, so you might as well throw your ingredients in. We're never going to be invited back.
So, Adjoa, you know, I think that I agree with you about, I think that everything that Lesley and Margot and all of us say, I agree 100%. I mean, these women are fantastic in what we do. I think that one of the struggles that I continue to have is that, and this is just not technology, but we're focused on technology industry right now, but this happens across all institutions, is that there are things that are in place, and we all know what are best practices. The issue comes down to when people don't do. And that is the biggest struggle I have, you know, if we were to put a highlight on technology industry, but we can do it with any institution. It's just that here's the group of we but are talking about this. They know, we know the stuff. We know it down cold from not only our personal experiences, from our professional experiences, and from the practices. And yet what is frustrating is to talk about what you had talked about earlier when we started. Why is it still here? And what can we do? There are infinite amount of information about what to do. The question comes down to how come it hasn't happened, and in this day and age, and what is it that continues to maintain a bias structure from the beginning to the end? And that's the piece that I struggle with, because we can give them all the best practices. Question is, are you going to do it? Are you going to implement it? Are you going to create the consequences as well as the carrots that move it forward, so individuals, because in technology, there are not a lot of people of color in the same place, they're spread out, do not have to get eaten up as trying to fight that battle alone.
Accountability and measurement.
I think you gave the answer. You said ABC. And as a behavior analyst, you just said it. The C stands for consequences. You have an antecedent, a behavior, and a consequence. We have to make sure that the consequences determine how someone moves forward. It's not and I don't want to go too heavy into the psychology stuff, although you brought it up. I'm going to go ahead and
I
entertain it.
can't help it. You don't know this, but I'm a psychologist.
Oh, you too. I'm an applied behavior analyst.
Yeah,
We should get together and talk all sorts of nerdy psychology crap. So yeah, I'm here for it. But the consequences, right? Like that is what determines behavior. That's how you change behavior, is by having consequences. Too often there are no real consequences, or they're written, but they're not actually enforced. And so it's the consequences that really shape behavior, and people get away with all sorts of things because they're differentially reinforced, if at all.
Yeah.
And then incentives and rewards sometimes
Yeah.
can be that opposition
Absolutely.
and helpful
Absolutely.
aspect to strive towards.
That's right. Listen, I think we're going to need a part 2, ITI, because this has been an engaging conversation. I do not want it to end. I will go to one question. I mean, and I think we hit on a lot of the answers from the questions. There's one that talks about many organizations are quickly and haphazardly creating initiatives at the moment in response to the current climate. What can be done to ensure this is no longer a phase occurrence and organizations are held to a standard from here on out, not just when the headlines get cold? So who wants to take that?
I would like to say to just make it measurable and accountable, intentional and systemic. It can't be training for training's sake or training by itself. It
Right.
has to have other interventions there, be the change you want to see. So just because your leadership's not doing it doesn't mean you can't give that suggestion. Understand that your network is your net worth. So how you navigate within your system at your workplace will matter, right? Who you're sponsoring as well as wanting to be sponsored. All of that will bubble up to the urgency that people begin to collectively make a change at every level. When it's happening at every level, it will be more impactful than when you're waiting for it at the top level. But the accountability and measurement, the best practice sharing across your ecosystem, I think is what will begin to hold companies accountable. You saw one company wanted to celebrate Juneteenth, everybody wanted to celebrate Juneteenth. So understand that influence and the power that you can have in your company for that and outside of it.
Excellent. Listen, I want to thank everybody before I turn it back over to Jason. I want to thank everyone. This has been an incredible experience. I know wherever you are in your walk of life, you walked away with something today. You know, we talked about strategies, we talked about how to recognize it in the workplace, and we talked about industry-wide and organizational-wide what can be done. So again, I am just hoping that everybody had something that they can take home with them and begin to put it into practice, because that's what it's about. Because as my grandmother used to say, when all is said and done, it's a lot more said than done. So we need to be doers and get it done. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason. Thank you all for our incredible panelists, Dr. Vandiver, Lesley, Margot, and Adjoa. Wonderful, wonderful session. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jason for his final remarks.
Tracie, and let me add my thanks to you for convening the group and leading an important discussion. My thanks to all of the amazing panelists and our ITI member companies who are represented here. And I hope you all benefited from this as much as I do. Tracie, to your point about the need to actually continue to take action, I want to ask everybody to take a look, if they would, and maybe even somebody from the ITI team can post this in the chat. On our website, you will see it just went live a minute ago, a blog post that I published expressing very serious concern about an executive order that was signed by President Trump on Monday of this week, barring federal contractors from engaging in some forms of diversity and inclusion training. Most, if not all, ITI member companies are federal contractors, and I wanted to lead the charge on behalf of the tech industry to express serious concern about that, because the kind of work that you've been talking about for the last hour is so important. And the idea that the federal government would cease contracting with companies that engage in these kind of efforts is enormously troubling. So to your call to action, Tracie, that you ended with, we're going to continue to push this forward as an organization on behalf of our members. And I thanked all the inspirational speakers who made me think a lot more about the importance of the work. And thanks all of you in the audience for attending, and know that ITI will continue this important dialogue, and more importantly, to Tracie's closing remarks, the important action that needs to be taken. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Great job.